Let me take a moment and talk about Riverside.fm. It allows you to record studio quality audio and up to 4K video. When you need to record audio and video, Riverside.fm can do it. So if you're looking for a hero platform for all your recording needs, from podcasts to webinars to any video content, Riverside.fm. I've got a promo code for you where you'll receive a 30% discount on the first 3 months of your subscription. I'll give it to you twice. The promo code is SHIPIT. All one word, SHIPIT, and you'll pick up a 30% discount on your first 3 months of your subscription. Riverside.fm.
We are so used to having numbers on jerseys of football players. It's very commonplace. But there was a time where there were no numbers, and the history and the evolution of the numbers has changed throughout time. Timothy Brown, author and historian, is on to tell us about the history of the jersey number coming up in a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with pigskindispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com and the all-new jerseydispatch.com. Welcome to the Pigpen. We have a great episode tonight. We're going to be covering basically both of our websites. We said jerseydispatch.com, something new. We're going to be looking at the history of sports through the jerseys, the uniforms, and sweaters that the players wore. And also pigskindispatch.com, we are all about football history. And we cover both tonight because we have historian and author Timothy P. Brown, who wrote the great books like How Football Became Football and the Fields of Friendly Strife, and his website, Fields of Friendly Strife. Tim Brown, welcome to the Pigpen.
Hey, thanks, Darren. Appreciate it. Looking forward to chatting again. We talked a couple months ago, and so that was fun. And so let's do it again.
Well, I guess before we get to the topic of the football jersey numbers history, you have some great articles you're posting. Looks like 3 to 4 every month on your website, fieldsofriendlystrife.com. And you really have some interesting ones that have popped up lately. I don't know if maybe you wanted to highlight some of those and maybe some that you have coming up that we can look forward to.
Yeah. So what happens with me is so in some cases, I'm writing articles that are kind of expanding on things that I wrote about in the book, but I just couldn't go as deep because of the nature of the book. It was more of a survey of, football history. So the site allows me to get into kind of oddball stories and just things that, typically you just can't even imagine happened or that were part of football at one point. But so that tends to be a lot of what I look for in the blog articles, just kind of strange things. I enjoy the oddities, but oftentimes the oddities tell you something about the nature of football at the time. They served a purpose, and they seem weird to us now. And I think the jersey numbering is one of the best examples of that. Football took some twists and turns to get to this numbering system we have today, but where we ended up isn't where we had to be. We could have gone in other directions.
Yeah, most definitely. But just to give a little tease to the listeners so they can go and check out these great articles from himself, here's a couple of the headlines that Tim has for some November headlines or articles that he has. The first one's very seasonal appropriate, the celebrating 150 years of Thanksgiving Day football. Very interesting article. Next one, in 1927, the confusing world of the goal lines. That's very intriguing sounding. And, you have one about the football West Point's football helmets since the first Southern team to play in the North. So all great articles just from your November editions, and there's plenty more than that. You have a couple years worth, I think, in there. So very intriguing and very unique articles indeed.
Yeah, thanks. And the in some ways, I think the one about 1927's interesting. I know it's not kind of our topic for tonight, but the fun thing there is that 1927 is when the goalpost moved to the end line rather than the goal line. And so there was a lot of concern that players and fans wouldn't know where the goal line was anymore because the goal posts had always been on the goal line. And so they knew where the goal line was, right? But now you shift it to the end line. It's like, well, where's the end of the field? And so, a lot of things that we take for granted today, like field numbering and decorated end zones and now pylons, but originally flags in the corners of the end zones. Those all, if they didn't just come about in 27, they became, had much greater use in 27 to help players and fans distinguish the field of play from the end zone. So just one of those odd things, but it happened.
Yeah, it's something that somebody maybe 100 years ago can appreciate, but us in the modern times, we're so used to having the goal lines on the end line, we don't recognize it. But yeah, I was the marker of the goal line. You're absolutely right. I'm glad you point that out. The one article that we want to focus in on tonight that really caught my eye, back in September, you wrote, and it was titled Football's Wacky Uniform Numbers. And you really get into some very interesting elements of the numbering system on players' jerseys in football. And I thought maybe it'd be a great time to look at the history of the football numbers on the jerseys of players.
Again, this is one of these things where we're very used to having players wear numbers in every sport. But that wasn't the case in the past. And really the first time anybody wore a number on a sports uniform, it was rugby players in New Zealand and Australia in like 1897 or so. And it's likely that Americans started hearing about that probably through Britain or whatever, but eventually no one wore numbers in football anyways, or baseball or basketball for that matter. And so Amos Alonzo Stagg was the first one, as far as I can tell, to really tout wearing numbers. And he did it primarily because it was for the fans. It wasn't anything for the players. It was because as football became popular, stadiums grew in size, fans and players were increasingly wearing helmets. Fans could not tell who was who on the field. And so numbers were a way to, to allow fans and frankly, the press especially, to figure out who was who on the field. But there was a lot of opposition to it as well. There were a lot of reasons why people did not want players wearing numbers. Again, an oddity from our vantage point, but it made sense at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting element that's introduced because, football, I believe, we definitely know it as probably the ultimate team sport nowadays. And I think it's sort of always been that way. And you think maybe there was some resistance to putting numbers on because it gave individualism to players and uniqueness to players instead of rather presenting them as a team?
Yeah, so that was a commonly cited reason. The football was supposed to be a team sport, and so just exactly to your point, numbering players would help identify them as individuals and would take away from that team element. But even the bigger factor in terms of the reason it was resisted was that coaches opposed numbering their players because it would help scouts and opposing coaches and players on the defense figure out who the best players were and more easily identify them as they shifted or changed positions in the course of the game. And so, there were a lot of, there were people who hung on for 20, 25 years to not wear, until it was required by league rules or the NCAA, they didn't number their players, or they found ways to pull a little trickery on the opponents.
Well, I'm sure quarterbacks of the modern era are sure glad there's numbers on them because that's the one way they can identify the Mike linebacker all the time. You always hear them calling out that number, who the Mike is, but it'd be hard without a number, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and well, think about it. There's we'll get to some of these later on, but so not only were there not numbers, but when numbers were introduced, initially they were just they were temporary, so it wasn't like, Red Grange was the first athlete to have his number retired, his, number 77. But prior to that, numbers were mostly a temporary thing. They changed from game to game, stadium to stadium. People weren't tied to, Jim Brown's 32 or, whatever it may have been.
Let's talk about that. Okay, no, so Amos Alonzo Stagg, he had the idea in your article, but he didn't really put it into practice right away. He sort of put it away for reasons that you said. He didn't want opposing coaches to identify his players and formations and where people were in certain instances, which is very understandable for the competitive aspect of it. But you bring us to another college game where the first recorded numbers were used. And maybe if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm just going to back up a little bit before that, just to say that. So what happened, Harvard built their, Harvard Stadium in 1903. It opened, towards the end of the season. And one of their innovations, because of the desire for fans, so this was the biggest stadium that had been built since the Greeks or the Romans, right? And so fans were far away from the field, and to help fans know who was who on the field, what Harvard did was they had these guys on the field that would kind of signal to the scoreboard operators, and the scoreboard operators would, like, the fans received a scorecard when they came into the stadium, and it would have all the Harvard players listed 1 to 25, and the Princeton players 26 to 50 or whatever it may have been. And the players didn't have numbers on their jerseys, but the guy who ran with the ball or tackled the ball carrier had their numbers posted on scoreboard so that people could kind of follow along to know who was who. But what happened is, late in the 1905 season, the athletic director at Drake in Iowa, they were going to play Iowa State on Thanksgiving Day, and he was aware of what Harvard did, but he misunderstood it. He thought the players actually wore numbers. So he got Iowa State to agree to have their two teams wear numbers. They were temporary numbers painted on canvas, and they were sewn onto the backs of their jerseys. And so that's the first game where American football players wore numbers on their jerseys. And there's a photograph available of that. So we know it happened. It wasn't, there's no contention about the fact that occurred.
And like you said, you had, I believe it was Drake who was wearing the numbers 1 through 25, and then Iowa State was 26 through 50.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So no repetitive numbers on the field.
Yeah. And, if you think about it, this is the first time they're wearing numbers. They're just trying to figure out a system that would make sense. And so, back then, a lot of times, teams would wear similar colors and everything, similar colored jerseys. That wasn't the case. Drake, I think, is blue and white, and Iowa State is, maroon and gold. But nevertheless, it was just a way to keep the two teams separate, and you'd know who was who.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Just the thoughts on how that numbering got started. I would have never imagined that, but that's very, very interesting indeed. Now, okay, so numbers, that was 1905 when that game took place, I believe Thanksgiving Day that you described. Now, how did the evolution of numbers go from there?
So Stagg was one who continued advocating for it, but he didn't, he was still like, hey, I'm not going to put myself at a competitive disadvantage. And so I think the next school that really kind of picked things up was Pitt. And, they still claim that they were the first to wear numbers, but, we know otherwise, but nevertheless. So, there were schools like, Carlisle with Pop Warner, they were playing Pitt, and Penn State was, so it was kind of a number of the Pennsylvania schools would basically agree with one another that we'll wear numbers when we play one another. And so it was kind of a negotiated thing. If the opponent would agree, then you'd agree. And in other cases, like when Pitt was playing like a St. Louis who wasn't at the same level as Pitt, they'd wear them anyways because they were going to stuff St. Louis in the game, so they didn't really have to worry about it anyways. So it kind of was still fairly isolated in the aughts. And then around 1913, a number of the what became Ivy League schools started wearing them. The Big Ten recommended, that schools start, having numbers on their jerseys. And so it was just one of those things that kind of slowly took off. But at the same time, it was all just numbers on the backs. Nobody wore numbers on the front of their jerseys until the 1920s.
And what do you think was the reason for that? Did they just wear them on the backs just so the press box would see like a downed player? Or
yeah, the only, I don't know that I've ever seen anything period documentation on why. I think that the two main reasons were that there was a period where schools wore like a school emblem on the front of their jersey. So that was, one reason why, you wouldn't want the number and the school emblem on there. But also, around 1916, 17, sporting goods manufacturers started putting out jerseys with, there's a couple names for them, but friction strips is, I think, the most common name. So those are those stripes that you see on the fronts of jerseys, and like a lot of the Red Grange pictures, you see those. And those helped players. They'd wear them on their arms too. They helped. They were kind of like non-stick surfaces, or they were sticky surfaces, and so it helped people, to keep them from fumbling. And so schools had all kinds of bizarre decorated fronts of their jerseys, and I think that kept the numbers off the front for quite some time. Eventually, you'd see some, like early 30s, you'd see some with those stripes and the numbers, but that didn't last too long.
Wow.
Pretty much, people started converting over.
Wow, very, very interesting. I didn't even think about the strips and the emblems. That's a good point. Yep. So very good reason why they would have them just on the backs. You don't fumble too much on your back, do you?
Yeah.
Unless you're doing the butt fumble or something, which we'll get a later episode of that. But okay, so they're wearing them on their backs. Now, what was we know what the initial numbering scheme was just to have unique numbers for the players, 1 through 50, each team, 25 apiece. But what were some of the other numbers, like you're saying, the Big Ten bringing them in, some of the other conferences? Was there any methodology of the numbering system that we could relate to today?
Well, early on, it was just, you'd split them between the teams, but beyond that, there was never, early on, there just was no rhyme or reason to it. Most of the time, teams had numbers early on. They'd have them between 1 and 25 because they only had 20 some guys on a roster anyways. But then, I think probably just people started saying, "Hey, I want number 77" or whatever it may have been, and so players at any position would wear any kind of number. There was really no kind of systemization to it. And eventually, some of the conferences required numbers. So like the Big Ten required teams to wear numbers. I believe it was starting in 1921. And so Minnesota and their coach, H.L. Williams, who was, an old school guy who was big on the Minnesota shift, he wanted to keep opponents from recognizing who was shifting where. And so he kept numbers off his jerseys. But once it was required, the first game his team went out there, they went out there with 4-digit numbers. So, I've got a picture of their quarterback laying in the end zone, and his number is 40 or 30, 24, 22 or something like that. It just looks bizarre.
Almost like a prison jersey type number.
And there was another guy later in the 20s, a guy named Dad Amos, who was the coach at Furman. And, he just wanted to pull people's leg a little bit. And they were playing a game against Turks. And so he put his team out there wearing Roman numerals instead of Arabic. Again, just tugging on people's chains.
He met the requirement, right?
Yeah, because it's classic stuff where coaches follow the letter of the law. When they think it's going to help them in some way, they'll follow the letter of the law or violate it in many cases. But that's why the NCAA regulations get so long, because people are going to find loopholes.
That's definitely for sure. Now I can tell you, like I said, I officiated for 27 years at the high school level. So I know probably the most important thing in our modern game that numbers do, besides, identifying a player if there's, multiple, personal fouls or something, you have some problems with them, but it's the numbering requirements, because so you know who the eligibles are by number. And 50 through 79, in high school football, those are ineligible all the time. You can't have have an ineligible number and go downfield in the high school level. We know you can in the pros. I think there might be able to in the collegiate level, but so that's really important to us. Now they were trying to do some things in early football with the early stages of numbering to try to do some of that, to have position specific numbers, I believe you talked to, and there's some interesting derivatives of that. Maybe we could discuss a little bit.
Yeah. So, well, this is just as an official, you'll appreciate this, even though it's basketball. But one of the issues that came up with wanting to have numbers on the front of the jerseys, some of that started arising in basketball before football, because referee would call a foul on a player, and basketball tracks the fouls by player, right? So the referees would have to have the player turn around so they could see their number, right? Because they just wore them on the back too. So anyways, in the position issue, it had to be really confusing early on, because it wasn't until I want to say the late 20s, maybe it was the early 30s, before, back then, offensive linemen could be downfield on any pass. There wasn't, now we know offensive linemen have to be behind the line of scrimmage unless it's, pass thrown behind the line, but that wasn't the case then. They could be 20 yards, 30 yards downfield. So it had to be really hard to figure out who was eligible and not without numbers on the front of their jerseys. So, I think that was one of the things pushing towards numbers on the front. The main push was just to have, just to help identify, for fans and everybody to identify who's who. But in 1941, the NCAA recommended the use of standardized numbering systems. So that would be numbering based on your position. But they didn't say what that would be. So what would be the standard? So there were folks who argued that that all the ends should have numbers ended in ones, and the tackle should have numbers ending in 2, and et cetera. And we know that we base the positioning, or we align positions and numbers with the first digit rather than the second. But that wasn't obvious initially. So people had alternative systems. Another alternative system that the coach at Arizona, the coach at Duquesne were pushed for in 1941 was to use alphanumeric numbers. So the first string left end would be E1. The first string left tackle would be T1. The right string right end would be E2, an even number, and first string right tackle would be T2. And so and backups would be T3 and 4 and all that kind of stuff. So there were some that tried that out. In fact, actually Lehigh used that in 29, 30, 31. And there's lots of images of them, applying that system. But it really wasn't until 1941 where that whole alphanumeric became, more popular. A couple of teams tried it. It didn't really seem to go anywhere. But LSU resurrected it in 1952, and they spent the whole season wearing, that alphanumeric combination. And so you look at the photos, go to their yearbook, and it just looks bizarre, but it made sense.
Yeah, it's probably the most logical system, even more so than today's numbers, because it makes perfect sense. So what they're doing in that, and it's
that system made sense in single platoon football. Okay, but once you start and players wore numbers based on their offensive position, not their defensive position. And when teams switched from 6-man to 7-man, 8-man defensive lines, the numbering got messed up. So, and then once we went to single platoon or, two platoon football, then, Katie barred the door, right?
Yeah, it would have been real mess on the 1980 Chicago Bears when the refrigerator Perry goes in the backfield. You have to change his jersey, or you need a different letter on.
Yeah.
He'd have all capital letters, I'm sure, though, with the size that man was. So yeah, that was some interesting things that they had there. Now, you also had so that was the alphanumerical with the alpha coming before the numerical, but you also have a story of where the numeral came before the alphabet letter in one instance, and maybe that's an interesting story to hear too.
Yeah, so that's like 1951, 51, 52 at Kentucky. Bear Bryant was the coach there, and he had a set of identical twins, the Jones twins, one of whom was the starting quarterback, at various times, but, significant player. The other one was more of a substitute, but still played a lot. And he couldn't tell the two apart. So he had them wear 1A and 1B. So everybody else on the team had, normal numbers, but they were 1A and 1B. they wore those numbers throughout their career. And you see team pictures of them, and they've got the 1A and 1B sitting right in the middle of the team. So it's very clear that they're the oddballs, but they were good players, so it didn't matter.
Yeah, I want to point out most of these descriptions of numbers that Tim's talking about. He has photographic evidence on his website, fieldsofriendlystrife.com, under the wacky numbers from September of 2021 article. Some great photographs that you dug up, and they're extremely interesting and worth the looking to. So,
yeah, well, yeah, thank you. It's fun. I spend. A lot of times when I'm just kind of halfway watching a football game, I'm flipping through digital copies of old college yearbooks, and so I just spot oddities, and I'm purposely looking for them, trying to find things that say, "What's going on here?" And so that's where I find half of that stuff. But another one that along the same lines. So, like we know, so our numbering system is our normal numbering system. It's halfbacks were supposed to start with 2s and fullbacks with 4s, and et cetera. But the AAFC, which was a competitor to the NFL post World War II, they used a different numbering system. So for them, centers wore 20s, guards wore 30s, tackles wore 40s, et cetera. So quarterbacks wore 60s. And so if you see, old pictures of like Norm Van Brocklin and some of those kinds of guys, or Marion Motley, running backs wore 70s. They've got these bizarre numbers, but they were systematic numbers in the AAFC. And the NFL allowed those guys to keep their numbers when the AAFC folded and 3 teams, entered the NFL. And so a couple of those guys, would keep their old numbers for the first couple of years. And then they said, no, we're all going to go standard. And so some of those guys switched numbers partway through their careers.
Yeah, that was extremely. I bet it had to be probably tough for some of those guys, like Motley, and I think Otto Graham had to change his number. Van Brocken, like you said, you're used to wearing that number. It's sort of like today, you can't imagine Aaron Rodgers wearing any other number than 12, or Tom Brady wearing any other number 12. Can you imagine if they the NFL was merged into some other league and they said, hey, you got to change your number. Quarterbacks can't wear 12. And, that'd probably be hard for the fans and the player themselves to lose some of their identity by losing that number.
Yeah. Which again, it's one of those things that, I'm certainly in my mind growing up, Jerry Kramer of the Packers was, the guy who made the big block in the Ice Bowl. He was my favorite football player. And so 64, that was the number, but 20 years before that, numbers really didn't make that much, didn't mean that much to individuals.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now we have had some recent numbering system. When I say recent, the 1980s, the NFL had some numbering requirements open up. Like jersey number 90s, as we were going through our study of the NFL numbers, going through one number at a time, the best players each number, that we started noticing in the 90s that there was less and less Hall of Famers, where they were more modern players that were, and that's because the NFL for a long period of time didn't allow players to wear number 90. They did early on, and back in the player for the Cardinals had just let 99 go to JJ Watt, the Goldberg.
Yeah, Marshall Goldberg. He, that back in that era they did, but there was like probably 30 or 40 years to like the 90s where they started letting like linebackers start wearing 90s. So that's sort of a modern thing that I sort of forgot about, that there were no players number 90s in the 1970s in the NFL, which is kind of interesting. Well, the NFL always had smaller rosters than college teams. So college teams, tended to use more numbers, for post, from probably the 60s on, when you truly went back to two platoon football, and some of the teams like the Nebraskas and those folks had 140, 150 kids on the team. The NFL always had fairly small rosters. Now they're much bigger, but so that's part of the reason why they didn't need to use the 90s.
Right? Yeah. And I guess college, was it last year, just allowed zeros to come back on as a legal number too?
Yeah. So Braylon Allen of the Wisconsin Badgers he's zeroing out for all of us.
Yeah, that's still so odd to see that. You haven't seen that since maybe the early 70s in the NFL with having players with number 0. You think of like Otto Grant, or not Otto Grant, but Jim Otto, double zeros. But I haven't seen that in decades, and now you're starting to see some of these collegiate players wearing it. So very interesting.
Well, to me, it's fun. I think guys get off on, and there's certain teams where a certain number is meaningful. 32 at Syracuse. There's numbers like that are just, it's fun and it's meaningful in certain teams to wear particular numbers, and I think that's a great tradition too.
Yeah, it certainly is. Now, is there anything else maybe that numbers wise that we have missed over the history of numbers, just to cover these, wrap this up?
I can't, I think we've pretty well, covered it. Yeah. I mean, it's, well, the only other thing I think is just that, if your listeners are, looking at, this is something that we've all seen, but maybe we don't have words for them sometimes. But in the mid 50s, there was it was like the American Photographers Association, some entity like that. As teams were, games were increasingly being televised, and then they're taking pictures and they're trying to identify who's at the bottom of the pile and things like that. For newspapers, they wanted more numbers on the uniforms. The photographers did, and the TV people. So in like 55, you started seeing teams start putting numbers on the sides of their helmets. So those were originally called spotter numbers for the spotters up in the booths. And then a number of conferences required that you wear, if you look at like yearbooks from 58, 59, 60, that era, everybody's got numbers on the sides of their helmets. Not everybody, but almost everyone. I
think we just saw that. I think the Cleveland Browns in the last couple of weeks just wore sort of one of their throwback uniforms, and they had their numbers back. I think back when Jim Brown's era, they had numbers on the sides of the helmets for the Browns.
Yeah. And then the other thing was TV numbers. So those tended originally, Georgia Tech in 55 was first one to wear TV numbers, which were numbers on their shoulder pads, or numbers on their shoulders. And then those became popular. Some teams wore them on their sleeves, right? But again, that's one of those things we just take for granted. We see numbers on various locations on jerseys, but that had a beginning too. So, but that was really more about, again, helping people watching on TV, on the small televisions of the time, and spotters up in the box and press people, helping them identify who is who on the field.
Yeah, it'd probably be helpful now most, because how many times you see like a player go down and they're down in a field, and some attendants are, hovering over them, covering up their numbers, and the announcers are lost. They don't know who it is. They know which team it is, but they don't know which player it is for a few moments. But probably those TV numbers, if we had them today, might be helpful in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, Alabama still has the spotter numbers on their helmet. A lot of teams have TV numbers somewhere, on their jerseys. But even then, like you say, some lineman's laying on the ground, and it's hard to figure out who he is.
Right, and they're all gigantic human beings, so it's hard to identify them. If you have Tyreek Hill on the ground, you probably can recognize who might be on the ground if you can't see his number. But some of the you have the big jumbo guys in the middle. Boy, they sure are big guys, so it's hard to tell. But Tim, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing this great history that you dug up on these fascinating variations of the number history of the jerseys on football. It's extremely fascinating, and you always have some great topics on there on fieldsofriendlystrife.com. Do you have anything coming up in the near future that we can look forward to that you're going to have coming out?
Yeah, I'm doing I'm kind of at the closing stages of, I'm writing an article about the 1919 transfer portal. So it didn't really exist, but basically it's focused on Northwestern University in particular. But as servicemen were leaving the service in following World War I, they had an opportunity to go to various universities, and just so happened a bunch of them went to Northwestern. And so I'm writing an article about that right now. I've got some other things coming up, related to the Rose Bowl before there was a Rose Bowl, the building, the stadium. So, just trying to find a couple of, kind of seasonal topics, if you will.
Well, sounds like some great stuff. I can't wait to read them, and I'm sure the listeners can either. Again, if you want to give us maybe your website address again and any social media you'd like to share with us before we let you go, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah. So my website is just, fieldsofriendlystrife.com. That's the name of my first book. And I just, have kind of left the website with the same name. I'm on Twitter, and every time I post I post all my new articles on Twitter. So there I'm just at FOFS. But if you search for my name, Timothy P. Brown, or Fields of Friendly Strife, you're probably going to find me. I've got a Facebook page dedicated as well. And again, mostly all I do on Facebook in particular is just I post my new articles. So whichever way that you find to follow, you can also follow me from my website itself. But it's available, and just welcome everybody to come on in and take a look at the articles, comment, tell me what's if there's things you'd like to hear about or read about. I'm open to ideas. I'm not saying I'm going to to follow all, but certainly open to it. And I've been collaborating with some other people of late as well, so that's fun. Somebody else has a great idea, and we kind of put our heads together and put an article together. It's like the one about the first Southern team to play in the North. I collaborated with a guy named James Gilbert, a UNC fan, and I think put together a fun and really interesting article. So
yeah. That's great stuff. And listeners, we have a link on the show notes of this episode that'll take you to Tim's site, thefieldsofriendlystrife.com, so you can follow that way and get to his social from there, as he said. So make sure you can use that link too if it's available to you. So Tim, I really appreciate you coming on here, spending the time with us. We always enjoy having you on. Hope to have you on again real soon. And take care and have a great holiday season.
Yep, you've got my number, and so anytime, more than happy to talk. But, and obviously you and your listeners have a wonderful holiday, and enjoy it all.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. we invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.